It began with a simple idea, something so small that no one thought it could ever spark a neighborhood-wide storm. A single homeowner, eager to bring a bit of color and personality to her otherwise beige and uniform street, decided to paint her front door pink. It was not just any pink, but a bright, cheerful shade that stood out vividly against the row of identical tan houses, each one indistinguishable from the next. For her, it was a personal statement, a way to reclaim a sense of individuality in a neighborhood that often felt soulless and rigid. At first, it seemed harmless. Passers-by slowed down, curious about the splash of color that now broke up the monotony of the block. Some smiled, finding it charming, while others whispered disapproval under their breath. But the pink door quickly became more than just a door. It became a symbol, something that challenged the silent authority of the homeowners association that oversaw every detail of the neighborhood. The HOA prided itself on maintaining uniformity, claiming that consistency protected property values. The board had rules for everything: the color of mailboxes, the type of grass that could be planted, even the shade of blinds allowed in street-facing windows. Nothing could stand out. Nothing could break the pattern. For years, the board enforced these rules with quiet efficiency, often without challenge. But now, with this door, something different was unfolding. At first, there were letters. The homeowner found polite but firm notices tucked into her mailbox. They reminded her of the association's guidelines and explained that all doors must be painted in one of 3 approved shades: dark brown, off-white, or muted gray. The pink, they said, was not authorized. The letters gave deadlines for compliance and warned of potential fines. The homeowner ignored them at first. She believed the door was her own, her property, and that she had the right to paint it however she wished. Days turned into weeks, and as the HOA's letters became more urgent, neighbors began to talk. Some quietly admired her defiance, while others worried that the HOA's threats could eventually affect them too. The first fine arrived after 30 days of noncompliance. It was a relatively small amount, but the letter carried weight. It spoke of further legal action if the issue was not resolved. The HOA escalated quickly, moving from friendly reminders to threats of liens and legal consequences. The homeowner's pink door, once a source of personal joy, now represented conflict and stress. Still, she refused to back down. The door remained pink, shining brightly under the summer sun. Neighbors noticed that more and more people drove by, slowing their cars to look. Some took photos. Word spread on local community groups, and soon the pink door became a local attraction. It was no longer just a rebellion against an HOA rule. It was a quiet protest against conformity itself. But with attention came scrutiny. The HOA board grew angrier with every day the door remained unpainted. At their monthly meetings, the pink door dominated the agenda. Board members debated fines, enforcement options, and even legal proceedings. Some pushed for aggressive action, arguing that letting one violation slide would open the floodgates to chaos. Others hesitated, fearing the negative publicity that was already building. Meanwhile, cracks began to form in the neighborhood itself. Families that once coexisted quietly now found themselves divided. Some sided with the HOA, believing rules existed for a reason. Others sympathized with the homeowner, feeling the rules had become too extreme, too controlling. Driveway conversations turned into whispered arguments. Social gatherings felt tense. The pink door had changed everything. By the end of the summer, the story had spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news outlets picked it up, framing it as a modern-day battle between individuality and regulation. Reporters came to film the door, interviewing neighbors on both sides. The HOA refused to comment, but their silence only fueled the fire. Online discussions exploded, with strangers across the country debating whether the HOA was protecting order or stifling freedom. And yet, the door remained. Each morning, sunlight glinted off its pink surface, and each evening, porch lights cast a warm glow across its bright paint. It had outlasted letters, fines, and warnings. It had sparked controversy and inspired quiet admiration. But as the weeks passed, tension only grew heavier. Something had to give. By the time autumn leaves began to fall, the HOA prepared its next move. They filed a formal notice of legal intent, stating that if the door was not repainted by the end of the month, they would proceed with court action. The homeowner read the letter with a heavy heart, realizing that the conflict had escalated to a point she had never expected. She had started with a simple desire for joy, but now she stood at the center of a storm that was larger than herself. The door was no longer just hers. It had become a symbol for many, a challenge to a system that had ruled quietly for years. The stage was set for a battle that would either crush her spirit or change the community forever. And as October crept closer, both sides prepared for what came next. What began as a single door had now grown into a controversy that refused to die down. The summer heat seemed to cling to the conflict, fueling tempers that were already running high. Neighbors who once exchanged friendly greetings now avoided each other, some refusing to walk down the street where the pink door stood. It wasn't just a splash of paint anymore. It had become a line drawn in the sand. The homeowner remained defiant, her bright door glowing like a beacon of resistance under the harsh midday sun. Each time the HOA sent another letter, she quietly folded it, set it aside, and refused to budge. For her, repainting the door wasn't just about complying with a rule, it felt like surrender. And she wasn't ready to give in. The HOA board, however, grew restless. Month after month, the door remained unchanged, and with every passing week, the board's authority seemed to erode. They prided themselves on their ability to maintain order, but here was one homeowner openly defying them, and worse, gaining quiet admiration from others. At the board's next meeting, the pink door dominated the agenda. The discussion was heated, with some members calling for swift legal action while others worried about the optics. Already, news crews had driven past the house, filming its defiant facade for short local news clips. The footage spread online, where comments painted the HOA as a group of bullies strangling individuality. It was a reputation the board could ill afford, but to them, the alternative was even worse, allowing one violation to stand unpunished. The fines continued to pile up. What started as a small penalty now grew into hundreds of dollars, and each new notice arrived with more severe language. Words like lien and legal proceedings began to appear in bold letters. The homeowner read each notice carefully, her resolve hardening with every threat. The HOA believed fear would push her to comply. Instead, it only deepened her resistance. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself fractured further. Groups of residents formed quiet alliances, whispering their opinions to those they trusted. Some believed the homeowner had gone too far, that her rebellion put everyone's property values at risk. Others saw her as a kind of hero, standing up to a system that had grown too controlling, too obsessed with uniformity. Even those who hadn't chosen a side felt the tension in the air. Every driveway conversation seemed laced with suspicion, every neighborhood gathering overshadowed by the pink door. Then came the petitions. One group of neighbors, firmly on the HOA's side, began circulating papers demanding strict enforcement of all rules. They gathered signatures at doorsteps, pressing residents to choose compliance over chaos. In response, another group quietly drafted their own petition, this one in support of the homeowner. They argued that individuality and freedom should matter more than conformity, that one door could not possibly bring down the value of an entire street. The petitions spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Residents who once cared little about board politics now found themselves forced to choose sides. Lines were drawn, not just on paper, but across front lawns and down cul-de-sacs. The pink door had turned a once quiet community into a battlefield of opinions. By late summer, the HOA board felt cornered. Their letters and fines had failed. Their threats of legal action had not broken the homeowner's resolve. And now, the media attention and growing petitions made the board appear weak, even foolish. Something had to be done. It was then that the board decided to escalate. They hired an attorney, drafting the paperwork that would bring the matter into court. Their hope was simple. A judge's ruling would force compliance, restore order, and reestablish the board's authority once and for all. But with that decision came risk. Lawsuits were public, messy, and expensive. The homeowner knew it too. When she received the official notice of intent to sue, she felt a heavy weight settle on her shoulders. What had begun as a small act of self-expression now threatened to spiral into a legal war. As autumn approached, the mood in the neighborhood grew darker. The leaves began to change, and so did the tone of conversations. No longer was the pink door a cheerful splash of color. To some, it had become a symbol of chaos. To others, it was proof that the HOA had lost its way. Whichever side one stood on, everyone sensed the storm building on the horizon. And still, the door remained, bright, unyielding, and stubbornly pink. The media attention only intensified. Larger news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a battle between individuality and conformity. Online debates grew fiercer, with strangers across the country weighing in. Memes appeared, some mocking the HOA, others praising the homeowner's defiance. What the board had hoped to quietly suppress had instead exploded into a spectacle they could no longer control. Neighbors who had once lived peacefully beside each other now glared across driveways, suspicious of where loyalties lay. The HOA's meetings grew tense, with raised voices and heated arguments spilling out into the parking lot. The board, once unified, began to fracture as well. Some believed the fight had gone too far, while others demanded they press forward no matter the cost. Through it all, the homeowner carried herself quietly but firmly. She had never asked for a battle, but now that it had come to her doorstep, she was unwilling to back down. Each morning, as the sun rose and cast its light on the row of identical houses, her door stood out defiantly, the first thing anyone noticed on the street. It had become more than a door. It was a symbol of a neighborhood divided, a rebellion against control, and a test of how far the HOA would go to protect its power. As October crept closer, the stage was set. Court papers were filed, deadlines were set, and the homeowner prepared for the fight of her life. What had started as a splash of paint had grown into a storm that could no longer be contained. And as the leaves fell and the days grew shorter, everyone knew the battle of the pink door was only just beginning. The neighborhood was no longer quiet. What had once been a peaceful suburban enclave with manicured lawns and carefully trimmed hedges had turned into a battlefield of opinions, whispers, and factions. The pink door still stood tall, shining brightly in the autumn sunlight, but now it was more than just a splash of color. It had become the center of a storm that no one could escape. By early October, the HOA made its move. A thick envelope, stamped with the law firm's seal, arrived at the homeowner's doorstep. It carried the unmistakable weight of authority. Inside was a notice of legal intent, signed by the HOA's attorney, outlining their plan to file suit for noncompliance. What had begun as a handful of letters and fines had now transformed into something much bigger. The association wasn't just threatening anymore. They were taking action. The legal language was cold and unforgiving. It spoke of breaches of contract, of community standards, of the obligation to preserve property values. It outlined escalating fines, potential liens, and the cost of legal fees that would be transferred onto the homeowner if the case were lost. The message was clear: repaint the door or risk financial ruin. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some residents shook their heads, muttering that it had come to this. Others whispered with satisfaction, believing that order would finally be restored. But many felt unease. It was one thing to send fines, but dragging a neighbor to court over a door color seemed excessive, even cruel. Quietly, support began to build, and petitions circulated once again, this time with stronger conviction. The community was splitting deeper right down the middle. Local media returned, eager to capture the next stage of the conflict. Reporters filmed the pink door under gray skies, their commentary layered with a tone of incredulity. Viewers across the city shook their heads at the absurdity of it, but also at the weight of the fight. It wasn't just a door anymore. It was a symbol of control versus freedom, of individuality versus conformity. Meanwhile, the homeowner weighed her options. The letters had been easier to ignore, the fines manageable, but the lawsuit was something entirely different. It carried real consequences, ones that could change her life permanently. Friends urged her to give in, to simply repaint the door and move on, but others encouraged her to stand strong. To back down now, they argued, would mean surrendering not just her pink door but her right to express herself at all. The HOA, too, faced pressure. While some board members cheered the legal approach, others worried about the mounting backlash. Already, local petitions had reached city officials, and rumors circulated that even state lawmakers were watching the case. The board wanted to protect their rules, but in doing so, they had stumbled into a spotlight they could not control. At the monthly HOA meeting, the atmosphere was charged. Neighbors filled the room beyond capacity, spilling out into the hallway, their faces tight with emotion. Some clutched signs, demanding freedom of expression. Others muttered angrily about preserving order. The board sat at the front of the room, papers stacked in neat piles, their attorney present to answer questions. Every word spoken seemed to deepen the divide. Outside of meetings, tension spilled into daily life. Neighbors no longer waved in the mornings. Conversations turned into cold stares. Even children sensed the tension, avoiding playdates and staying indoors. The pink door had reshaped the very fabric of the neighborhood, weaving distrust and suspicion where once there had been polite distance. By late October, the case had been formally filed. A court date was set for early winter, and preparations began on both sides. The HOA gathered its records, the covenants, the letters, the escalating fines. They believed the law was on their side, that their contract with the homeowners carried the weight of enforcement. But the homeowner wasn't without allies. A local advocacy group for property rights reached out, offering assistance. They saw the case as a chance to challenge HOA overreach, to draw a line in the sand against associations that wielded too much power. With their help, the homeowner secured legal representation, someone willing to fight not just for a pink door but for a principle. The media swarmed again when the news of the upcoming court case broke. Headlines painted it as the battle over the pink door. And soon, it was no longer just a local story. National outlets picked it up, intrigued by the mix of suburban drama and deeper legal implications. Online, the debate raged. Memes spread, arguments flared, and suddenly, the small cul-de-sac was at the center of a national conversation. The pink door, once painted as a gesture of joy, had now become a symbol in a war that felt far larger than the neighborhood itself. Each day, cars drove slowly past the house, some honking in support, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The homeowner grew accustomed to strangers snapping photos, journalists camping at the corner, and the endless flood of commentary online. As October faded and November crept in, the case loomed like a storm on the horizon. The neighborhood braced itself for what was to come. Every passing day felt heavier, each glance at the pink door charged with meaning. And yet, despite the pressure, the door remained. Bright, bold, unflinching against the gray skies of autumn. The stage was no longer just set for a neighborhood battle. It was now set for a courtroom showdown, one that would decide not only the fate of a door but the very balance of power between individuality and conformity. The pink door had become history in the making, and soon a judge would decide whether it would stand or fall. Into the neighborhood like a slow shadow. The once vibrant lawns turned brittle, trees stood bare, and the air carried a chill that seemed to mirror the tension everyone felt. The pink door, still standing defiantly, now looked out over a street that was no longer familiar. Cars still came and went, holiday decorations appeared on porches, but beneath the ordinary rhythm of suburban life, something extraordinary was unfolding. The lawsuit had become real. Court documents were filed, attorneys retained, and preparations underway. For the homeowner, the stakes were no longer abstract. What had begun as a joyful act of personal expression had grown into a confrontation with powerful consequences. She knew that if she lost, the fines, legal fees, and potential liens could crush her financially. Yet if she gave in, she would surrender not only her pink door but also her right to individuality in a place where conformity ruled. The HOA, too, braced for battle. Their board meetings stretched late into the evening, stacks of documents piled high as they rehearsed their case. They leaned heavily on the covenants, rules written years before, insisting that uniformity was the foundation of the community's value. They believed they had the law on their side, and they were determined to prove it. Yet beneath their confidence, unease stirred. The attention had grown too large, the spotlight too bright. For every resident who supported enforcement, another whispered doubt about whether the HOA had gone too far. As the court date approached, the courthouse itself became a focal point. Reporters gathered outside, cameras poised to capture the clash between neighbor and association. Local stations broadcast live segments, while national outlets sent correspondents to cover what they described as a symbolic trial of American suburbia. Online, debates raged hotter than ever. Supporters of the homeowner saw her as a pioneer, standing up against excessive rules. Defenders of the HOA argued that she had agreed to the covenants and should face the consequences. On the morning of the first hearing, the atmosphere was electric. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity, neighbors arriving in groups, some carrying handmade signs, others keeping their faces low, uncomfortable with the attention. The homeowner walked quietly into the building, her attorney at her side, determination etched into her features. Across the aisle, the HOA board members arrived as a cluster, their lawyer leading them forward with polished confidence. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The walls seemed to hold their breath as both sides took their places. The judge, stern and composed, presided with authority, reminding everyone that this was not just a spectacle but a matter of law. Still, even he seemed aware of the cameras outside, the world watching. The HOA presented its case first. Their lawyer moved with precision, holding up the association's covenants and reading aloud the sections that mandated uniformity. Photographs of the pink door were displayed as evidence, side by side with images of the approved colors. To them, the violation was clear. They argued that allowing one deviation would open the floodgates, eroding the very foundation of order that kept the neighborhood desirable. Their words were sharp, confident, and bolstered by years of precedent. But then came the homeowner's turn. Her attorney stood with calm conviction, reminding the court that covenants were not beyond challenge. He spoke of personal rights, of freedom within one's own property, and of how an association's power must have limits. He presented the escalating fines, the threats, the attempts to intimidate. He painted the pink door not as a rebellion, but as a symbol of individuality in a system that had grown too rigid, too controlling. Spectators shifted in their seats, their expressions betraying their divided loyalties. Some nodded at the HOA's arguments, fearing what chaos might come if everyone painted their homes however they pleased. Others leaned forward at the defense, feeling the injustice of a system that could drag a person into court over the color of a door. The judge listened intently, occasionally taking notes, his face unreadable. Outside, the world speculated endlessly. Legal experts on television dissected each argument, property rights advocates rallied online, and neighborhood associations across the country held their breath. Everyone wanted to know which way the ruling would lean, because everyone sensed that this was about more than one house in one neighborhood. As the day stretched on, both sides laid out their evidence. The HOA showed their rules, their fines, their enforcement records. The defense showed community petitions, news articles, and testimony from neighbors who had come to see the door as a symbol of hope rather than harm. The courtroom became a stage where suburban order and personal freedom collided. When the hearing adjourned, no verdict was delivered. The judge announced that he would take time to review the evidence, and both sides would return for a ruling in the coming weeks. The tension only grew heavier. Neighbors spilled back onto the courthouse steps. Reporters swarmed with questions, and the image of the pink door once again flooded screens and feeds across the nation. Back in the neighborhood, the door still stood. Snowflakes began to fall, clinging softly to its bright surface, as though even winter wanted to highlight its defiance. For the homeowner, every passing day felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see which way the ground would give way. For the HOA, the waiting brought little comfort, their authority now under the microscope of the entire country. The case was no longer about a single rule or even a single community. It had become a test, a trial by fire that would shape how far HOAs could go and how much freedom homeowners could claim. The pink door had transcended its small beginnings, becoming the center of a battle that was both deeply personal and profoundly public. And as the year drew to a close, Both sides prepared for the decision that would come next. The homeowner clung to hope. The HOA clung to order. The judge held the power to decide which would prevail. The storm had moved from the streets to the courthouse. But the eye of that storm was still the same door, still pink, still standing, still waiting. Winter passed slowly, each week measured not by the calendar but by updates from the courthouse. The first hearing had left the community unsettled, neither side victorious, both sides clinging to hope. In the quiet suburban streets, the pink door stood unchanged, its bright color now a permanent feature of the neighborhood. For some, it was a beacon of defiance. For others, it was a constant reminder of disobedience. In the weeks that followed, the lawsuit became the talk of the town. Local news stations ran follow-up stories, interviewing residents who stood firmly on one side or the other. Social media buzzed with clips of the homeowner walking into the courthouse, contrasted with sound bites from the HOA's attorney defending their rules. The story, once confined to a single street, had grown into a regional spectacle. People from other neighborhoods began weighing in, some even driving by just to take photos of the infamous pink door. The attention strained the HOA more than anyone expected. Board members who once worked quietly behind the scenes now found themselves scrutinized by the public. At grocery stores and school events, residents confronted them, questioning their judgment and their use of community funds to pursue the case. Some board members stood by their decision, convinced that enforcing the rules was necessary to preserve order. Others began to doubt whether the fight was worth the growing resentment. Cracks that had once been invisible now widened into full divisions. Inside the neighborhood, relationships frayed further. Neighbors who had once exchanged holiday cookies now avoided each other's eyes. Driveway conversations turned icy. Children who used to play freely together now overheard their parents whispering sharp words about that door or those rules. The pink door had become more than paint. It was now a fault line running through the entire community, separating families who had once felt united. As winter gave way to early spring, the case moved toward its next hearing. The homeowners' defense team, bolstered by donations from sympathetic strangers and advocacy groups, prepared to challenge the HOA's authority on constitutional grounds. They argued that property rights and personal freedoms outweighed a rigid set of aesthetic rules. Their approach shifted the case from a neighborhood dispute to a broader battle that resonated across countless HOA-governed communities. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down. They brought in additional legal support, spending more from the association's funds. The treasurer presented grim financial updates at board meetings, noting that reserves for neighborhood projects, landscaping, maintenance, even pool repairs, were shrinking rapidly. Still, the board pressed on, convinced that losing this case would destroy their ability to enforce any rules at all. They believed that one pink door could open the floodgates to chaos. The second hearing drew an even larger crowd than the first. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their cameras capturing every entrance and exit. Protesters held signs, some reading "Freedom to Paint," while others declared "Rules protect property values." The division was no longer confined to one community. It had spread, symbolizing a clash between individual expression and collective order. Inside, the courtroom felt charged. The homeowners' team presented evidence of other communities that had collapsed under the weight of overreaching HOAs. They showed letters from residents who felt bullied by their associations, painting a picture of power wielded without accountability. Their case resonated with spectators, who leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the larger implications. But the HOA's lawyers countered with stories of neighborhoods that had thrived because of strict enforcement. They argued that property values depended on uniformity and order, that one exception could unravel the fabric of an entire community. They painted the pink door as a threat not only to aesthetics but to financial stability, appealing to the fears of homeowners who saw their property as their largest investment. As arguments unfolded, it became clear that the case had grown beyond the simple matter of one door. It was now about power, rights, and the balance between individuality and community standards. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable, occasionally jotting down notes as each side made its case. When the hearing ended, the community was left in suspense once again. No verdict was delivered, The judge announced that more time was needed, and another hearing would follow. Both sides left the courthouse exhausted, carrying the weight of a battle that showed no signs of ending soon. Back in the neighborhood, the division deepened. Signs began appearing in yards, some pink in support of the homeowner, others beige in solidarity with the HOA. The once uniform street now resembled a patchwork of loyalties, each home silently declaring its stance. The homeowner watched it all unfold with mixed emotions. What began as a simple act of joy had turned her into an unwilling symbol, a representative of a fight much larger than herself. She never imagined her choice of paint would lead to protests, lawsuits, and national headlines. Yet here she was, her door standing firm while the world debated its meaning. Meanwhile, the HOA board struggled in private. Late-night meetings grew tense, with raised voices and sharp words exchanged across the table. Some members threatened to resign, unwilling to shoulder the growing anger from neighbors. Others pushed harder, convinced that giving in now would ruin everything they had built. By spring, the pressure reached a breaking point. Rumors spread that one board member had begun secretly leaking information to the press, frustrated by the association's refusal to compromise. The leaks painted the HOA in a harsh light, revealing internal conflicts and financial mismanagement. What had once been a unified front now appeared fractured and vulnerable. The stage was set for a dramatic climax. The next hearing was announced as the final one, where a ruling would be delivered. The community braced itself for a decision that would either affirm the HOA's authority or strike it down, reshaping the neighborhood's future. As the date approached, tension hung in the air like a storm ready to break. Neighbors avoided each other, whispers filled the streets, and all eyes remained fixed on the pink door, its color as bright as ever beneath the spring sun. The battle that began with a single stroke of paint was about to reach its peak, and no one could predict how it would end. The morning of the hearing arrived with an eerie stillness. For weeks, the community had lived in a state of agitation, but on this day, a hush fell over the neighborhood. It was as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the outcome that would either restore balance or completely unravel everything the HOA stood for. Residents dressed with care, as if preparing for a ceremony, and gathered their families before walking toward the community center. Even those who had avoided the conflict until now came, drawn by the weight of history unfolding before their eyes. Inside, the atmosphere was stifling. The long tables were lined with HOA board members, their expressions stiff masks that betrayed fatigue and unease. At the far end sat the homeowner, her presence quiet but commanding. For months she had borne the weight of judgment, ridicule, and praise in equal measure, yet she arrived composed, standing as tall as the door she had painted. Behind her, rows of neighbors filled the seats, their whispers dying into silence as the proceedings began. The pink door had become more than wood and paint. It had become a symbol of defiance, identity, and community fracture. The opening statements were read, sterile words layered over months of tension. The HOA presented its case with precision, pointing to rules, bylaws, and precedent. They argued that without compliance, the neighborhood would slip into chaos, each home becoming a canvas for personal whims instead of a unified vision. Their words painted the pink door as a threat to order, a harbinger of decline. Yet as they spoke, the audience shifted uncomfortably. What once seemed like a logical defense now carried an edge of desperation. When it was her turn, the homeowner's representative spoke softly, but with undeniable conviction. They described the door not as rebellion, but as expression, a harmless choice that had become the battleground for much deeper issues. They reminded everyone of the protests, the lawsuits, the headlines, and the financial strain the HOA had inflicted in pursuit of a single color. They asked the question no one could ignore. Had the association lost sight of its purpose, spending its energy policing a door while ignoring the unity it claimed to uphold? The hearing stretched into hours. Evidence was revisited, minutes of old meetings read aloud, and photographs of doors across the community displayed as though they were criminal evidence. Yet beneath it all was the inescapable truth. The battle had gone too far. What began as paint had spiraled into something unrecognizable. The HOA was no longer protecting its vision. It was fighting for its pride. Outside, reporters waited with cameras ready, their lenses aimed at the entrance. The story had grown beyond the neighborhood, drawing eyes from across the country. The pink door was no longer just a local curiosity. It was a national symbol of homeowners fighting against overreach, of individuality clashing with conformity. Commentators on television debated its meaning while social media turned it into a meme, each new post fueling the spectacle. As the board deliberated privately, the crowd waited in unbearable silence. Children fidgeted in their seats, spouses exchanged nervous glances, and the homeowner stared at the table in front of her, unmoving. She was exhausted, but resolute. Win or lose, she knew she had changed something. The door would stand, either as victory or as defiance. When the decision finally came, it was announced with heavy formality. The ruling was clear. The HOA had overstepped. While it retained authority to regulate certain aspects of community appearance, its pursuit of this single case had been deemed unreasonable, fueled more by obstinacy than genuine necessity. The pink door, the board ruled, could stay. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some cheered. Others shook their heads in disbelief. For the first time in months, the homeowner allowed herself a quiet exhale. She had not sought to be a symbol, yet here she was, standing victorious. The door behind her would remain exactly as it was, bright, defiant, and unforgettable. The fallout, however, was immediate. Several board members resigned in disgrace, their credibility shattered by months of infighting and leaked scandals. Neighbors who had once supported the HOA turned away in embarrassment, questioning the fees they had paid and the trust they had placed in the association. What had been a fortress of control now appeared fractured, its authority weakened beyond repair. Yet amid the wreckage, something new took root. The community began to see itself differently. Some residents, inspired by the outcome, repainted their homes in subtle ways, adding splashes of individuality where once conformity had ruled. Others, still wary of disorder, called for caution. But no one could deny that the pink door had changed the neighborhood forever. The homeowner, for her part, returned quietly to her life. She did not seek more attention, nor did she flaunt her victory. She simply lived, her door a silent testament to resilience. Over time, the protests faded, the news crews departed, and life in the neighborhood found its rhythm again. Yet the story of the pink door lingered, passed from neighbor to neighbor, retold with awe and disbelief. Years later, newcomers to the community would ask about the door. And each time, they would hear the story of how one simple choice sparked a battle that shook the foundations of the HOA, tested the bonds of neighbors, and revealed the cost of pride. The pink door remained, a quiet reminder of how fragile authority can be when it forgets its purpose. The fight had ended, but the lesson endured. Sometimes the smallest acts create the biggest changes. And in that neighborhood, long after the headlines faded, one bright pink door stood as proof.